Okay, another mistake that a few of you made, not too many, but this is super important, so this is worth going over again with everybody. And I actually mentioned this in the statute screencast, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. And that is to look at the heading information whenever you are looking at a resource that's organized by subject. And the reason for that, a lot of reasons for that, but one important reason for that is that when you do keyword searching, the danger is that the system's going to pull up the documents with your keywords. But again, computers are stupid. They don't know what you're thinking and what your subject is and what your issue is. So a few of you did a search for label or misbranding and false labeling or just false labeling, and you came up with this section in New York jurisprudence. And it's New York jurisprudence, food, and labeling and advertising. That sounds pretty good for our issue, right? I can totally understand why you might have thought this is a great section. What constitutes misbranding? That even sounds like that's relevant. But if you look carefully here at the heading, what you see is we're part of the food, drug, poison, and hazardous substance title, so that's got food in it, that's good. But we're in the portion of that section or that area that talks only about drugs, poisons, and controlled substances. So that should tell you that's not really relevant for your title. If we take a look at the full table of contents, we see that yes, we are in the food section of the encyclopedia, but subsection 1 is about food. Subsection 2 is, again, only about drugs, poisons, and controlled substances. And that section we were looking at, 128, comes within this subsection 2 and really isn't relevant for your client because she's not interested in producing drugs, poisons, or controlled substances, not involved with that. So again, very important to look at that in that heading information of whatever resource you're looking at. When I did the state statutes screencast, I mentioned that in the screencast in relation to looking at statutes, because statutes are arranged by subject just like encyclopedias are. Very different content, but the arrangement is similar. So very important that you do that for statutes as well. Okay, any questions about that? Okay. Also very important, and I'm thinking actually about adding this as a theme for the course. A few of you cottoned on to this, and I realized I should really say this more explicitly, because this is really important. It is important as almost as, or maybe as important as to make it a theme, and that is, I always think of research as a detective hunt. You pick up a little clue here and a little clue there, and that gives you another clue to move a little bit further. Maybe you learn another keyword, maybe you learn another issue, maybe it gives you an idea of a reference to a primary source, and then that primary source gives you little clues, and you move on until you finally get the big picture. And the theme being that one single resource isn't going to give you everything most of the time. Sometimes you'll get lucky, and it will. But for a complex issue like the ones we're looking at in class with regard to ERISA, or the one I'm asking you to look at on your assignment regarding advertising and labeling, those are more complex issues, and one resource isn't going to give you the entire answer. So you need to pick up those clues as you go along. And again, those clues can be key terms, those clues can be citations, those clues can be another reference to a secondary source that helps you a little better than the first one. Because maybe the first secondary source was kind of, sort of okay, but not great, but then it references one that is great. Or likewise, you get a reference to a statute section that's not really on point, but you look at the table of contents and you find one in the table of contents that really is much better. So again, a theme for the course, another theme might be following the detective, as the detective following the clues. And last and probably least, we'll be going over this in much more detail when we talk about administrative materials. A few of you were confused and gave a reference as the CFR for a statute. The CFR stands for the Code of Federal Regulations. So the CFR is actually an administrative regulation. It's not legislation. It's not a statute. We've now talked about statutes. So you should now know that looking for statutes for federal, you're looking for USCA or USC sites, and for state, it depends on the state. Here in New York, we're looking for McKinney's in the titles and the sections. Since we hadn't gone over that at the time, I didn't penalize anybody, but I did want you to know the difference now that you are moving on to, that we've already talked about statutes, and now that you're moving on to do your statutes assignment. Speaking of which, since we did not have class, and I did the makeup through the screencast, I wanted to make sure that you all had as much as I could possibly give you, given that we didn't have class. So first of all, I didn't hear back from everybody regarding whether you got the email regarding the makeup that I sent through Lexis Classroom. If you did not get that email, please speak to me either at the break or after class. Some of you did let me know that you did, so you're fine. And if you got it, you're fine. Just let me know if you didn't get it. One of the handouts I've put out here is actually the walkthrough, what I call the walkthrough, the sample pages that I would have given you if we had had class. I wanted you to have that because that will have basically what you would see in the books in print McKinney's. I also put that walkthrough on the course website, and again, that will be under statutes. And the one that's on the website's a little different than the one I handed out, because again, I was planning on having class, so that one was prepared as if we were going to have class. This one that I put here on the course website, and I will point you to State Statutes Walkthrough with Notes. This one has some notes, and those notes are designed to help you with the assignment. So you might want to take a look. And again, because we didn't have class, please feel free to ask if you're confused about anything, because as much as I tried to make that screencast as clear as possible, I at least believe it's not the same as my being able to interact with you and you seeing me and being able to ask questions. So please don't hesitate. And as I mentioned in the email, hopefully you all got it, because of that and because of the craziness with the scheduling, I've extended the deadline for the assignment, so you have another day, essentially. So that way, in next class, because we're talking about state materials again, that'll give me an opportunity to highlight for you some of the things that might help you with the assignment, and then you'll have an extra day to use those tips. Any questions about all of that? Okay, so we are now moving on from statutes, and we are going to talk about legislative history. And what, you may rightfully ask, is legislative history? Legislative history, essentially, you may recognize this from our first statute screencast, not the makeup. Legislative history is essentially what happens up to the point where the president signs the bill. So my sort of joke with the original statute screencast is that it's the middle of the story. It's parts 4 through 6 where we talk about statutes. Well, now we are moving to the very beginning of the story, where we talk about parts 1 through 3, where we talk about how a bill becomes a law. Okay, so that's what it is. Why are we bothering with this? And especially because I will warn you, not to intimidate you, but quite the opposite. A lot of people find this the most difficult part of all of legal research. And I will include librarians in that. I have librarians who've been doing this for quite a few years who tell me it's my least favorite part. They get the heebie-jeebies when someone has a legislative history question at the reference desk. Happens to be my favorite part, but that's neither here nor there. So if you are finding this a little daunting, confusing, don't panic. Don't say, oh my God, I can't believe I can't get this. A lot of people do. That being said, and also, as always, don't hesitate to ask. That being said, why do we have to go through this if even librarians find this so daunting? And the answer to that is there are a couple of different reasons why you would do legislative history research. The first is to determine legislative intent. What did Congress, what did the state legislature mean by whatever it is that they put in the statutes that you're now looking at in the code. And my favorite example of this is in a case called Chase Scientific Research. It's actually a New York Court of Appeals case. This is a state case, but the rationale is true for federal as well. And a lot of time, not a lot of times, occasionally, maybe even not so often or rarely, a court will look to what did the legislature mean when it put in the language that it did in a particular code section, a particular statute section. And here in this Chase Scientific case back in 2001, the court's decision actually revolved around legislative intent. And I'll just read you a little bit of language here. The court replaced the 2-year limitations period. So it's the court is looking back at the legislature, replaced the 2-year statute of limitations. It's a statute of limitations case. Let's see if I can find some more language. In response to a Sears case, the legislature amended Section 214 to clarify limitations periods. Again, so what the court is doing is it's looking back and it's saying, moreover, our objective, as always in matters of statutory interpretation, is to effectuate the will of the legislature. So the court is looking back at what the legislature considered as it was creating the language for this statute section at question, Section 214, and it's looking back at the documents produced by the legislatures. So it's looking back at a legislative report. It's looking at something called a bill jacket, which we'll talk about at length next week when we talk about New York legislative history. And the court is implementing the legislature's intention. So again, legislative intent. Now, so this is an argument. I always kind of like to think that these attorneys that argued for the winning side in Chase Scientific, that there was some very enterprising young associate who dove into legislative history research and found this legislative report and was able to locate the language about what Section 214 really meant and why the legislature did what it did in adopting the language in 214. And this young associate was a hero because he or she knew how to do legislative history research. It's probably a fantasy of mine, but anyway, it's possible. So that's why you might want to do legislative history research, is to determine the intent of the legislature. But in fairness, you should know that not all judges consider legislative history, the documents that led up to the enactment of a particular statute. Not all judges think that that is what you should be looking at for the legislature's intent. And one of those judges was Justice Scalia, and I believe there still are justices on the Supreme Court as well as other courts who may share this view. And this is in a concurrence in a case Conroy v. Aniskoff. Doesn't really matter the case, but Justice Scalia goes on and talks about the greatest defect of legislative history is its illegitimacy. And I can pretty much leave it at that. There's some great debate in a case, which I should probably find someday, between Justice Scalia, who doesn't believe researching legislative history is valid, and Justice Breyer, who very much does believe that that's how you determine legislative intent. And I tell you this just to make you aware that if you find yourself in the position of doing legislative history research, you should be prepared for an argument that, a possible argument that really researching legislative history does not show the legislature's intent. The other reason you might be interested in researching legislative history is, instead of looking back to the history of the documents that led up to a particular statute, you might actually want to find out what's going on looking into the future. So checking bill tracking. What is the status of a particular bill that's before a legislature, and what do we think might happen to it? Although obviously nobody has a crystal ball. Okay, so that is the why bother. So as I mentioned, a lot of people find this challenging. So what I have tried to do is to boil down, as I like to do, all of legislative history research into 4 points. And that is the Key to Legislative History handout that I have given you. So if you understand these 4 points, you're good to go. Now, the subsequent pages go into a little bit more detail because I realize this probably isn't enough for you to walk out right now and understand how to do legislative history research. So essentially, what you need to understand is the legislative process. What are the documents produced at each stage of the bill as it moves from being introduced to becoming a law? So understanding the legislative process, understanding, again, as I said, what those documents produced are in each step of the process, and recognizing their abbreviations. And I know that sounds pretty simplistic, but I think a good part of the battle is when you see a citation, understanding what it's citing to, right? If you can remember back to your first year and you saw all those F-sups and F-thirds and all that crazy stuff and you had no idea what you were looking at, and now, of course, you're all experts at it, so you don't even think twice. It's a lot easier, right? Same thing's true for legislative history documents. And I tried, again, to make that easy for you. On page 5 is a listing of most of the abbreviations that you'll encounter for the different types of documents. Okay, step 3, know how to find the, in caps, all-important public law number or state session law number. And the good news is you all already know how to do that because that's what we talked about in the last 2 classes. But we'll review it again just to be sure. And then finally, know 1 or 2 good sources that are free and maybe some that cost a little bit or more than a little bit of money. So that's the key to legislative history research on a single sheet of paper with a lot of space on it. Let's dive in and think about those different steps. So let's talk about the legislative process. And this probably many, if not all of you, had at some point in your educational career. And I like to look to, yes, another cartoon. And this one, I know some of the other cartoons were a little fluff. This one actually do pay attention to because it does have the substance of the process and even a lot of the documents that are produced and what they are. So it's only a few minutes. Some of you may have seen it before, some may not, but again, I think it's a really great instruction on the legislative process. And now the volume won't work. I tested it before and it did. Oh, that's because somehow it got muted. There we go.
Woo, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that St. Louis crap of paper is.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long week while I'm sitting in committee. But I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will. But today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." And he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill. And I'll remain a bill until they decide to make me a law. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And I got as far as Capitol Hill. Well, now I'm stuck in committee, and I sit here and wait while a few key congressmen discuss and debate whether they should let me be a law. I hope and pray that they will. But today I am still just a bill.
Listen to those congressmen arguing. Is all that discussion and debate about you?
Yeah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Most bills never even get this far. I hope they decide to report on me favorably, otherwise I may die.
Die?
Yeah, die in committee. Oh, but it looks like I'm going to live. Now I go to the House of Representatives and they vote on me.
If they vote yes, what
Then
happens?
I go to the Senate and the whole thing starts all over again.
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah. I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill. And if they vote for me on Capitol Hill, well, then I'm off to the White House where I wait in a line with a lot of other bills.
I resisted the temptation to stop in the middle and point out all the good documents that he was talking about. We'll do that as we go through. Anybody see that before? Your parents are probably my generation. We grew up on that stuff. Okay, so let's dive in and look at some of the details of what our friend, the little Bill, the process that he went through. He did sound like, his voice did sound like a he, so I'll stick with that. Okay, and the way we're going to do that is by looking at our key handout. So we're on page 2, and I will also refer to the sample pages, what I call the walkthrough, the big fat handout. And page 1 of the walkthrough, the big fat handout, just gives you a picture in more detail of the whole process. We're not going to go into nearly that level of detail, because I don't really think it's necessary for our purposes, but for those who like that level of detail, there it is. And page 2 gives you the definitions of the different versions of the bills. Again, that also is a level of detail that we don't need to know for our purposes, but you might come across the reference to an enrolled bill. That's about the one I would say you might want to remember, because that typically is the step before what goes to the president for signature. Okay, and here we see in print what our little bill, we don't see his picture anymore, would look like in print. And a couple of things you want to notice. First, you'll see it's from the 107th Congress. So you might remember Congresses are numbered, and I'm going to go back to these listing of Congresses that we saw when we talked about statutes the first day. So we can scroll down and we see that the 107th Congress, again, all Congresses last 2 years, that started in 2001 and ended in 2002. And we see that the bill abbreviation, and you'll see that on the abbreviations page in the key handout, the bill for the House bill is HR. A lot of people, even experienced attorneys, get confused and they think HR stands for House Report, which truthfully makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't. HR, if you see HR, you need to know that that is a bill, not a report, so try not to get confused by that. So we are looking at HR 2563. The number is just a random number assigned from the 107th Congress. This is actually a bill that is, if you read down, amends the Employer Retirement Income Security Act. So this is a bill that amends ERISA. This isn't the original bill that enacted ERISA. It's just one of the proposed amendments. Okay, so as we saw, our bill gets... And let's turn to page 4. And essentially, you see just what we saw when we looked at an act. You see a table of contents and all the sections. So a bill is basically in the form of the final act. So that, turning to page 5, as we saw, a bill will get referred to an appropriate committee and usually subcommittee. For the particular area or areas that a bill covers. Sometimes a bill can cover many different areas, so it might go to several different committees or subcommittees. And at that point, the committee will hold a hearing. So this is the second document. Now a hearing typically, as you see, will be abbreviated a couple of different ways. You typically will not, sometimes you won't see a number with a hearing, sometimes you'll just see the whole title the way we see it here, hearing before the subcommittee on health of the committee, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and that's how it'll be cited with the date. Turning the page, you see the table of contents of this particular hearing. This particular hearing also happens in the 107th Congress, so it was probably about the same bill. And basically what a hearing is the subcommittee decides to educate the members about the particular area. So it invites interested parties to testify in front of the committee. So you will see you see on page 6 of the walkthrough, you see witnesses, and then you see submissions for the record. So there'll be oral testimony, people actually going to Capitol Hill, sitting down and testifying before the particular subcommittee, and you'll also have people who submit written testimony. And you see that on the table of contents, page 6. The record of the oral testimony, you'll see what that looks like on page 7. It kind of looks like a play, if you've ever read a play in print. So you have the name of the person, Mr. Stark, and Mr. Stark says, "Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing on the question of patient protection," etc. And so that is what a hearing looks like. Turning to page 8, we see something called a committee print. This is not something you'll encounter very often. It's basically if the committee determines it needs some technical assistance in understanding a very technical area, science, math, whatever. This happens. This example has to do with tax, not surprisingly. That's pretty technical. And you can see what that looks like on page 9. Again, you're not going to see a print too much, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. But turning to page 10. Page 10 is where we see a report. So in your notes, or whatever you're doing on the handout, whatever works for you, put a big star, highlight in yellow, red, blue, green, whatever catches your attention. The committee reports are typically the best source for legislative intent when you're doing federal legislative history research. So committee reports, and frequently there's more than one, because as I said, different committees can look at different aspects of a particular bill. And it even says that on your key handout. So if the bill is approved, the committee will issue a report. You may remember our little bill guy said, and if I'm reported out of committee, that's what he meant. He meant if the committee issues a report. And again, that report is probably the best source for legislative intent. And as I mentioned here on the handout, because it has a section-by-section analysis. That means the committee it tells you, we are passing, it gives you an overall purpose. We think that this is a great idea because blah, 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 blah. And then we're going to go through each section and tell you what we mean by each section. So that's why I say that it is usually the best source for legislative intent research. So again, with regard to the abbreviation, remember HR is a bill. It's not a report. So the way you'll see reports abbreviated, you can see on the key handout on page 2, HRPT, HREP, basically H, if it's from the House, it'll be H, and then R with more letters after it. If there's just an R, it's just a bill. Again, that's a source of confusion for a lot of people, so I am going over that a lot. A Senate report, the Senate also issues reports, a little less confusing, but the same abbreviations. Any questions so far? Okie doke. Okay, there's also a document known as a committee document. Again, you're not going to run across that too frequently. The details there if anybody's interested, but I don't want to belabor that since it's not necessary. But before I get ahead of myself, let's turn to page 11 on the walkthrough and go back to reports a moment. And I mentioned the section-by-section analysis, but shame on me, I didn't show you an example. So here's one on page 11, where the committee that issued this particular report talks about the overall purpose. So it talks of the particular bill that it's reporting on. And then if you turn to page 12, you will see after the overall purpose in the section-by-section analysis, you will actually see the section-by-section analysis. So the committee is telling us section 101 coverage, and this is what I will cover. In section 102, duty of disclosure, this is what they mean. And this report actually that I reproduced here is a report from when ERISA was originally considered back in 1974. So if you turn to page 12A, you will see a section by section analysis. You will see section 514, and hopefully by now that rings a bell. Section 514, remember, is the section of the public law, our Hero 93406. Section 514 is the section that enacted our code section that we're looking at for our client, 1144. So here we're looking at this particular report, and we're thinking, oh great, we're finally going to get what Congress meant by all of that stuff. And all it tells us is all state laws would be preempted except for those covering plants not subject to Titles 2 and 3. So unfortunately, a lot of times, you're not really going to get too much more detail, and that's the frustration of doing legislative intent research, is sometimes Congress just didn't spell out what they meant, or the state legislature didn't spell out what they meant by particular language that they adopted in legislation. But with legislative intent research, you got to try. Like you saw in Chase Scientific, sometimes you do find useful information. Okay, so that's a report in more depth. Questions? Make sure we covered. All right then. Let's go to page 3 on the key handout and turn the page, and we'll see if I can do this or not. And go back to, this takes too much time, I won't do it. So in our video, so if you remember that scene in our video with the entire House of Representatives saying yes, we move to the next step. So when a bill is reported favorably out of committee, the committee issues that very useful report, and then the bill goes to the full chamber. So if the bill started in the House of Representatives, as the example we did, so we know that because HR is the abbreviation for House Bill. So we're now in the full House chamber where they debate the bill. And what I would like you to do in your handout and in your notes is, especially in the walkthrough, is where you see Debates of Congress on page 13. Put an equal sign between Debates of Congress equals Congressional Record. And there's no real place for me to write on the board. And I want you in your mind to just equate those two. So when you hear Debates of Congress, you are going to think Congressional Record. And when you hear Congressional Record, you're going to think Debates of Congress. Exactly. On page 13 of the walkthrough, you see a whole lot of mishmash of information. Don't worry about it. Isn't that nice? That's a whole background of, because the Congressional Record is the name of the publication, where obviously, as I've now said several times, you will find the Debates of Congress. It used to be called other titles. Don't worry about it. When you see references, for the most, 99% of the times, it'll be to the Congressional Record when they're talking about Debates of Congress. So the Congressional Record, as you can see, is a fairly complicated publication. So there are really 3 things you need to know about it. One you already do, Debates of Congress equals?
Congressional Record. Congressional
Record. Okay, so let's take a closer look for things 2 and 3 about what you need to know about the Congressional Record. So on page 14 is the Congressional Record from back in 1974. And the Congressional Record back in 1974 was published, actually this is one of like 20-something volumes for the 93rd Congress. And this is actually the volume that we are looking at. So if you're interested, you can pass around and do weightlifting. And what you'll see the dates on page 14, so that particular volume covers February to March, and it covers pages 4153 to 5628, whatever. numbers that are there. And if you turn the page on page 15, it looks, again, people speaking. It looks like a play, like debates. So you'll see Ms. Holtzman has a few things to say. Mr. Erlenborn also has a couple of things. Mr. O'Neill. So again, this is what the Congress people are said on February 28th, 1974. Why do you care? Again, congressional record isn't something you'll use that frequently. For legislative intent, you'll be looking at committee reports. Although I have to say, there was a student in this class last year who, while we were going over legislative history, she, for her law firm, was asked by a partner to do legislative history research. So it worked out kind of well for her. And it turns out what the partner wanted her to do was to look in the congressional record to see if she could find some policy arguments for whatever the issue was, I don't even remember, and to show that the Congress people at that time were talking about this particular policy issue, and this is what they were saying about it. So, as much as I don't think you'll use the congressional record that often, here's a real-life example from a former colleague of yours who actually did have to look at it. So that's what the congressional looks like back in the 1970s. If you turn the page of the walkthrough to page 16, what you'll see is a more recent, what's called daily edition. And this is the second thing you need to know about the congressional record, is that the older versions were published first in what's called the daily edition. So daily condition would look like this, and then was transferred over to that big fat bound edition, wandering back wherever it is. And the problem with that is they changed the pagination. And as silly as it sounds as something important to remember, this will reduce your confusion significantly if you can remember this difference. If you see a citation to the congressional record, and again I gave you the abbreviations in the handout, if you see just a number, that means it's to the bound version. It's probably going to be an older citation back in the 70s or before. If you see a letter and then a number, then it's to the daily edition. And back in the days when they transferred it, there could be both. So it would depend on which edition you would, it was citing to as to which one you would look to. These days, like today, it's mostly just the daily edition. And the daily edition actually still does come out in paper. I am holding the daily edition from January 24th, 2019. And we actually have a couple of days after that. I thought this one was more fun, believe it or not. And I'm not going to pass this around quite yet. But the one we're looking at on page 16 is the daily edition for August 2nd, 2001, as you can see. And notice on the bottom, I've given you a handy-dandy arrow. It's H5179. H, not surprisingly, means it's from the House of Representatives, as you can see on the page. You can just leave them back there. I'll pick them up later. Oh, you're passing it around. Never mind. Sorry about that. So H is going to be from the House of Representatives. So any H numbered page, you know where that's from. And again, you can see what that looks like on page 17. And we see here Mr. Solis is talking about the Real Patients Bill of Rights to protect people from harmful decisions made by their health insurance plans. So that could be kind of interesting for our client. Again, I'm not sure we're going to want to make a legislative intent argument for her, but you can see the relevance, I hope. And then turning to page 18, again, we see the daily edition for August 2, 2001, but this time it's the Senate, so not surprisingly, the page number starts with an S. And that's how you know it's the daily edition, so that way you know what you're looking at. Again, we come back to the theme of bibliographic awareness. If you understand these seemingly insignificant details of how a page is numbered, you understand what you're looking at if you see a citation. And now it gets kind of funky because there are a couple more letters that you will find. Turning to page 19, you won't run across this too often, and don't really have to worry about it or remember it, but I think it's kind of interesting to know. Also in the daily congressional record, you will see E-pages, and E-pages stand for extensions of remarks. So what the Congress people, both House of Representatives and Senators, get to do is they get to extend the remarks. They get to add into the congressional record things they actually didn't say when the actual debates of Congress was happening. So in an odd sort of way, they can actually go back in history by adding these extensions. So you can see on page 19, the Honorable Representative Towns added some remarks, as did the Honorable Representative Cannon and Oxley. They changed the history of August 2, 2001 by adding remarks to what was actually said on the floor of the House of Representatives that was recorded in the congressional record. So those are the E pages. And the D pages stand for Daily Digest. And the Daily Digest is essentially an annotated table of contents for that day's congressional record. So sometimes, I mean, this one's kind of fat. This one, how many pages does it have? And this can say, so this one maybe has, I don't know, 30 or so pages. They sometimes can be pretty fat. So rather than have to sort of page through all of them, if you find the D pages, which oddly enough tend to be in the back, you can see a table of contents, so you can hone in on what it is that you're interested in rather than having to flip through the pages. And I'm sure now I'll start on this side just for variety's sake. So those are the D pages of the daily congressional record. Again, you won't have to worry about those too much, but in case you run across them, there's your explanation. And what we see looking on pages 21 and 22 is a reference to what might have been interesting for our client if we are interested in legislative intent research regarding holding health plans accountable for wrongful denial or delay of medical care, etc. And we would find that using the Daily Digest and then going back into the reference pages, or in this case, we'd have to go to the next issue and go to the reference pages. Okay, so the three things to remember about the congressional record. 1, congressional record equals
Debates of Congress.
Debates of Congress. Second thing is there can be 2 editions, the permanent and the daily edition. And 3 is the different page numbers. So the permanent edition has regular numbers. The daily edition has letter numbers. And letter could be H, S, D, or E. Any one of those tells you it's the daily edition. Does that all make sense? Okay, I will take silence as a yes. Okay, so then we have our debates in one particular chamber, the House of Representatives. And if you may remember, our hero of the bill then goes from the initial chamber and gets dragged over to the other chamber, and oh yes, it starts all over again, where he has to go through committee and go through hearings, and then go to the floor of that chamber, where there are debates that you will find where? Congressional record. Debates of Congress either in the House or the Senate will be in the congressional records, either in the H pages or the S pages of the daily edition. So as you see, turning to page 3 of the key handout, step number 4, the bill then goes to the full chamber and is debated. Step number 5, if the first chamber passes the bill after the debate, then it goes to the other chamber and goes through steps 1 through 4 again. So it goes through, as I said, have hearings, if they are reported out of committee and reported favorably, so the committee votes yes, we want to continue, we approve this bill, then a report is issued and it goes to the floor of the second chamber. They have debates in the congressional record. So once the measure goes through both the House, both chambers, the House and the Senate, it's very possible that because as the bill is debated, it can be amended, remember. So it's very possible that those 2 versions can be somewhat different. So if that happens, and it doesn't always happen, but if it does, then the two chambers have to appoint what's called a conference committee. And the conference committees, people from the House and people from the Senate, meet together in a brand new committee called a conference committee, and they try to hash out the differences between the two versions that got passed in each respective chamber. So what you may remember reading about in the last couple of weeks is we had this government shutdown that caused a lot of difficulty for a lot of government workers and other people and people traveling, etc. And then finally there was this committee that met of basically House and Senate leaders, and they hashed out an agreement. That hashed out agreement in the conference committee then went back to the House and Senate, or actually I think it might have gone to the Senate first and then the House, it doesn't matter. They voted on the agreed upon version that they agreed upon in the conference committee, and then they presented that to the president. And in this particular case, I think it was last Friday, the president signed the legislation. So that's exactly how, as you can see, described on page 3 of the key handout. The conference committee, just like regular House and Senate committees, also issue a report. And just like House and Senate committee reports, the conference committee report is also a really good place for legislative intent research. It's essentially another committee. It's just a different type of committee because it's made up of both senators and representatives. The strange thing about the conference report is it sometimes has the abbreviation, or a lot of times has the abbreviation of a House report. So it won't, in its abbreviation, tell you all the time very clearly that it's a conference report. Sometimes it will. Sometimes you'll see HConf-REP, but not always. Or sometimes you'll see SConf, or just SREP or RPT. And let's take a look at what a conference report might look like. On page 23, so note on top you see report, and then you see number 93-1280. And I should have pointed this out on the regular committee report as well. The committees are assigned, the committee reports are assigned numbers, and they look pretty much the same. The first number, again, is going to be that Congress number. So we know we're in the 93rd Congress for this conference report. And then the next number is just a random number. If we were to look back, as I said, I should have pointed this out when we talked about committee reports. So it's good. Now we can do some compare and contrast. If you look on page 10 of the walkthrough, you'll see the same thing, report, and then the number 93 again, so we know that that's the 93rd Congress, and then dash, and then a random number, 533. So again, they're both labeled reports. They both are committee reports, just different types of committees. Back on page 23, again, back to our conference report. So our conference report lets us know what the original bill was, and it tells us, of course, it's a conference report. And typically what a conference report will discuss is the areas of disagreement that they had to work out. The areas that they both adopted the same language, they really don't have to talk about, right? So they frequently will not include any discussion of those areas that they originally agreed on in the conference report. But the ones that they had disagreed on, that they worked out a compromise on, that's what appears in the conference report. So turning to page 24, or I'm sorry, 23A, you'll see examples. So it describes how the House bill requires annual reporting and the Senate bill requires submission of comparable, and so the conference substitutes and adopts the reporting format contained in whichever one it says. So it's describing to you the differences and how they worked out. Sometimes they just adopt one rather than the other. Sometimes they work out totally different language. It depends on, obviously, what they agree on. Turning to page 24, we see that actually this conference report discussed Section 514 of the bill, so the original bill that ultimately enacted ERISA. And it actually talks a little bit about the preemption provision and what it was going to do and what they ultimately what they adopted. The substitute provides, congressional, whatever. So here's an example where one committee report didn't tell us much about what Congress had in mind for Section 514, but it turns out this conference report gives us a little more detail. Whether it's relevant to our client or helpful for our client, you'd have to read through it, but hopefully you can see how understanding what the reports do as well as what the numbering is. In other words, we know we're interested in Section 514 of the original public law for ERISA, that we can at least determine whether or not this is going to be useful for our client. Questions about conference reports or other committee reports? Okay, so we've got to the stage where our bill is running across, and assuming the other chamber has approved, the conference committee sits, and if the conference committee comes to an agreement, as in the example I gave you of the appropriations bill, it goes to the president, and we are back where we started, where the president signs the law and the bill signs the bill and the bill becomes law. So we are back to my favorite slide where the president signs and our bill becomes law. Now that, of course, that doesn't necessarily happen. It's possible that the president can veto a measure. So it's talked about now that so the president has issued a national emergency, and there's talk about whether or not the House and Senate are going to pass resolutions basically disapproving of that, and very likely if they do, the president would probably veto that, because if the president issued the national emergency, he's not going to veto the bill, he's not going to pass the bill that disapproves it. So then, as our cartoon suggested, it could go back to the House and Senate, but again, remember, to override a veto, they need 2/3, so it's not just a majority. So as it was suggested in the cartoon, that's very unlikely that's going to happen, which is typically the case. It's very rare that a veto is overridden. But usually in the political process, the politicians don't like it to get that far. So we'll see what happens. But just trying to bring this whole process into present day to let you know that this happens, and this does have consequence. But if the president does sign, the president will frequently issue something called a signing statement. And as we see on page 25 of the walkthrough, now this is the signing statement from 1974, the signing statement for ERISA. And looking on page 26 of the walkthrough, you see the statement by the president upon signing ERISA. And you'll see what that looks like on page 27. So the presidential signing, so the president will sometimes sign and say why he thinks it's a wonderful idea. Sometimes the president will try to insert what he thinks or how he thinks the legislation should be interpreted as a way of trying to goose the system of legislative history, or legislative intent. I couldn't tell you how well that would work because I don't know that that's ever made it to the courts, but that was something that presidents tried to do in the past. So sometimes the presidential signing statements can be consequential. Sometimes they're just, this is a great idea and wonderful for the American people, and it leaves it at that. You will find these presidential signing statements. Again, I don't think you would look to it very frequently, if much at all, for legislative intent research. It might be for other historical research. You would find these in a couple of different titles. They're essentially the same thing, the compilation of presidential document. It used to be weekly. Nowadays you can find it on the web and it's daily. And you see the abbreviations there. And so we are back really where we started, way back when we started talking about statutory research. And we're back with the public law and our hero, Public Law 93-406, as it went through that entire process. So again, if you understand that process and understand what each document does, and mostly understand you want to start, at least for legislative intent purposes, with the committee reports, both regular committees and conference committee, you'll understand the majority of what you need to know for legislative intent research. Any questions? Alrighty then, let's take a break and come back at 5:20, and we will look at the next steps in our key to understanding legislative history research. Look at our key handout, and on that key handout, back to page 1, we've looked at the legislative process, we've looked at the documents produced by legislative process, and hopefully you have a better understanding of both of those. The abbreviations again are on page 5 when you have questions about that. So if there are there any questions about steps 1 or 2? Okay, so as you may remember in talking in step 2, the documents produced, or I should ask you in fairness, do you remember which documents are the best source for researching legislative intent? Anybody remember? In the key? Yeah.
Committee report? Yeah, sorry.
Committee.
Sorry, I thought you was...
Committee report and conference committee report. So you're both right. So we know that's the best place to go. How do we find that document? How do we get there? And that brings us to step number 3, how to find the all-important, in capital letters, public law or state session law number. And the reason it's the all-important public law number is that that's the key to finding any of these documents produced in the legislative process, including that wonderful committee report that's going to be the most useful for legislative intent. Now, the good news is we've done this already. So this will hopefully be essentially a review. And the reason for that is when you are doing legislative intent research, you will be most of the time wanting to know, okay, what did Congress mean when they said whatever they did in section 1144 or section 1132, or fill in whatever other code section that you're interested in that you're researching legislative intent about? What did Congress mean by the language in this code section? So the first step to researching legislative intent is finding the all-important public law number. And the way you do that is you take a look at the history or credits. And now we've already done this, right? We take a look at the public laws that have enacted our section. So on Lexis, you go to history. And remember this whole, I had you read through and I made you say, and amended by, every time we looked at the semicolon. I did that for a reason, because now hopefully you understand how to read this. So you now understand how to find the all-important public law number. So we know the public law number that enacted section 1144 is this very first one, 93-406. And then we know as we go through that it's section 514 of that public law number. And then we see the semicolon, so we know that it is and amended by this public law number, and so forth. And we know that the last time Congress had anything to say about section 1144 was in Public Law 109-280 back in 2006. So we now have found our all-important public law numbers, plural. So the first one we will absolutely have to check is 93406, because that enacted the whole thing. So you probably will always want to check the legislative history documents for the enacting public law. But the question is, what if the language you're interested in is in one of these others, right? Do you have to check every single one of them? There are what, probably close to a dozen there? And the answer is, thankfully, not. I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself here, so we'll come back to it in the walkthrough, because basically where you go is to the what are called historical and statutory notes. Here on Lexis, it's just notes, and you basically just scroll down to amendments. And what Lexis and actually Westlaw will tell us, and Bloomberg also, is for each year, it will tell us what the amendment did. So this 1983 amendment, it's telling us, provided that Section 301C of such act, subsection B, added paragraph 5. So if we were interested in paragraph 5 of subsection B, it actually got amended in 1983. So you want to take a look at these historical and statutory notes, or amendments to the notes on Lexis, to see which public law, or possibly public laws plural, might have changed or affected the language that you're interested in. So it depends on the section or subsection that you're interested in to see what they did. Let's take a look at the same thing on Westlaw, just for reinforcement purposes, as well as just so you can see how it works on Westlaw. So anybody remember where the public laws, what the name is of the section that tells us the public laws on Westlaw? Just credits, excellent. So you scroll down on Westlaw to the bottom, to the credits, and we see the exact same information. Now on Westlaw, it works a little bit differently, because if you scroll, you don't get any further. You need to know to go to history. And on Westlaw, I don't know why they do this, it bugs the daylights out of me. They change the name and they call it Editors and Revisers Notes. And on Westlaw, once you remember to go to Editors and Revisers Notes under the History menu, then you scroll down to Amendments, and Westlaw shows you the amendments in reverse chronological order, where Lexis showed you in chronological order. Again, no idea why. But Westlaw tells us, and you can maybe see it a little bit better, that the 2006 amendments for subsection E, it added subsection E. And scrolling down a little bit further, we see, if we were interested in subsection B8, Public Law 103-66 did something with that, and you could read on and see how it's not to be construed. And if that were language you're interested in, then you would know, okay, I have to take a look at, probably want to take a look at our original public law, but I also want to take a look at Public Law 103-66. Any questions? Again, that hopefully is a review in finding the all-important public law number. So let's take a quick look at the walkthrough handout, so you see what that looks like in print. Starting on pages 28, we see the USCA. And again, we've seen this before, what a Section 1144 looks like. And we see those credits or history. In print, there's no name for it at all. It's just in parentheses at the end of the section. And then we see the historical and statutory notes. And I give you the clue there, so which sections each amendment affected. So it helps you determine which public law to use. And going to page 31, you see pretty much what we saw on Lexis and Westlaw. You want to know to go to the amendments. The print and Westlaw gives you some other information. First, you want to jump down to where it says amendments, and then you see it starts and it goes in reverse chronological order. starting with the most recent amendment and going backwards. And of course, if we were in the print, we would want to remember to check the pocket part, but since, if you may remember, our book didn't have a pocket part because it's very recent. Okay, so pages 33 on the walkthrough are essentially screenshots to help you remember how to find the public law online. And I'm hoping that this will help you as you go through both the workshop and once we get the legislative history assignment, you can come back and get a refresher on how to find the all-important, public law number. And I want to highlight for you, it's important to understand that the first public law number is the enacting law. That's what brought the whole section into being. I've often asked you what the last amending public law number is, and that's not because it's necessarily significant. It's more just to make sure that you understand how to read that whole statement of the public laws that affected your section. The only significance the last public law will have is it will tell you the last time Congress did anything with this particular section. And that honestly is not that important information. That's not very important information. So don't read or misinterpret my emphasis of that last public law. It's just a way of showing you how to read this statement. Questions? Turning to page 34 on the walkthrough, I'm showing you on Westlaw how to get to the editors and revisers notes, and then again scrolling down to the amendments so you can read the different amendments and figure out which public laws you need to look at in order to find committee reports and whatever other legislative history documents may be of interest. And then on page 35, I did the same for Lexis. So I showed you a little bit of out of order of what's in the handout. Again, the handout is to provide you with a memory aid. Then you need to go back. Okay, any questions on how to find the all-important public law number? I joke a little bit, but seriously, that is the key to legislative history research, is you need to find that public law number. All right, so then how do we actually finally get to these documents that we've talked about for the last hour and a half? So now I come to part 4, or step number 4 of our key to legislative history research, and that's know 1 or 2 good sources, both free and some that cost money. And I'm going to show them to you in the order that I think, the order that of my preference, that I think are the best ones first, and then we'll go back. And so we are going to start with Hein Online. Hein Online actually has, we talked about Hein Online for the Law Journal Library. Just as a quick refresher, you'll find a link to Hein Online on the library homepage. But Hein Online has a lot of other material. As I've mentioned a number of times, we looked at the U.S. Code on Hein Online. Now we're going to look at the U.S. Federal Legislative History Library. And you'll see what I'm doing on page 36, again as a refresher for you. So this U.S., and you have to know it's labeled U.S. because the Hein Online libraries are alphabetized. So under U.S. Federal Legislative History Library, I'm going to the Federal Legislative History Title Collection. And going to page 37, it gives me the option of publication title, but I don't know what their publications are called. But it also, thankfully, gives me the option of the all-important public law number, though it doesn't say all-important. Or it also gives me the option of the popular name. Remember, we have a popular name table where you can find the U.S. Code section and the public law number of acts you know by popular names. And remember, we also have the translation table that will help us translate between public law number section and U.S. Code section. But back here on Hein Online, So if I know my all-important public law number, which thankfully we now know how to find, I go to public law, and then since I'm interested in our hero, 93406, I'm going to go to the 93rd Congress, and then I'm just going to scroll down to the right number, 406, and sure enough, there's Employee Retirement Income Security. I'm going to click on that. And turning from page 37 to 38, you'll notice the handout's a little wonky here. It's because I wanted to add extra pages to better explain this after I had printed the whole thing out, and I didn't want to reprint the whole thing and kill more trees. So on page 38, actually, if you look up on the screen, we have a couple of choices, which I didn't reproduce because I didn't want to kill even more trees. But on page here on the screen, we have a couple of choices for legislative history for ERISA. There's a 22-volume one and a 3-volume one. I tend to like to go for the larger one because it gives me a more complete listing of the documents. And so here we are back on page 38. And the reason I like Hein Online the best for legislative history research is that now I am at our public law, I can do a keyword search. So if I have particular terminology, which is usually why you're researching for legislative intent, I can actually search all of these documents on Hein Online. So if I type in preemption, as you see on page 38, and then if we go to 38A, you see the results. And we see different documents within that 22-volume collection that mention the word preemption. And the way I can see, now of course, what document do I want to go to first for legislative intent? What document type? Committee reports. Excellent. Whoever said that. So the way I do that on Hein Online, and again the handout on page 38A is trying to show you that, is this section type, and then I want to remember the show more link. I don't know why Hein Online hides the good stuff, but you have to click on show more, and then I can choose House reports or Senate reports, or I could actually choose both, but I have to do it one at a time. So I go House reports, and Hein Online will pull them up for me. And if I click on show more another time, I can add those Senate reports because I want to look at both. And so here are the four places where I can find my term discussed in those reports. And I can turn to that page and take a look. So that's why Hein Online is my favorite place to start for legislative intent research. I, of course, can go to those particular documents and scan through them if I want to also. So why not just stop there? Hein Online's pretty good, right? Unfortunately, Hein Online does not have every single public law that was ever enacted. So it's possible that Hein Online title collection will not have the public law that you are interested in. So that means, unfortunately, you may need to look at other sources. Also, Hein Online is not free. You are, of course, can get it from anywhere right now since you are still a student here at Hofstra, but once you graduate, you would have to come back to the library in order to use Hein Online. You're very welcome to do so, but if you find yourself points distant, that might be a little difficult, and I don't know if you'll be near a library that has Hein Online, or if your employer will have Hein Online. So Hein Online is really great, but it has its limitations, as sadly most things do. So let's now take a look at Westlaw. So Westlaw, as we left things, we were here at 1144. We went to history because we knew that in order to figure out which public law we needed to go to editors and revisers notes. And Westlaw just randomly called it that. I don't know why. But I also know to scroll down to amendments and I look and figure out which amendments I may be interested in. So maybe I am interested in Public Law 10366. So if I read this and said, oh, that sounds interesting, I should look at that, I will click on the Public Law link. And you can see I'm trying to show you that on page 39 is what I'm doing here. And then here I look at the text of public law. That's not going to tell me much about the intent behind what wound up being included in the public law. For the intent, I need to go to the Legislative History Materials tab. And here I see the different documents that we talked about with regard to the process of legislation that led to the enactment of Public Law 103-66. So here I see, here are those reports again. So the reports will be the first place I go to. I could also look at the congressional record. Remember, congressional record is what? Equals debates. Great. But I'm going to definitely start with the reports. Now, the reason Westlaw is not my favorite is that I will need to click on each and every report to then take a look. And it's hard to know what these reports are about because this is an omnibus bill. Omnibus means it just covers a whole lot of different areas. So I would go one by one. I'm just going to pick one randomly to show you the next step. And then looking at the report, I could then do a Control F. I could scroll through the table of contents and see if there's anything of interest, and I could also do a Control F to essentially do a simple term search. You can't really search the document or use the Westlaw search bar, unfortunately. And what I might do when I'm scanning through here is to see if I can see quickly in the table of contents where the section by section analysis is. Sometimes you'll see it and sometimes you won't. But you can always, again, as I said, do the Control F and see. So this section preempts state law. So we can see if that is useful. But again, on Westlaw, you remember there was, I don't know, half a dozen reports. I'd have to do this for each and every one. So that's why I like Hein Online better. If, again, I have access to Hein Online and if Hein has the public law that is of interest to me in its legislative history title collection. Any questions about Hein Online or Westlaw? Okay, and so you can see on page 40, I'm showing you scrolling down to reports. What I didn't show you on the screen is that in addition to reports, what Westlaw, will sometimes have is what's called a compiled legislative history. That's essentially what we were looking at in Hein Online, where it pulls together all of the documents together. So I could look at each part, which takes a while. If I needed more than, say, the reports, I might want to take a look at the compiled because then that will give me the PDF for all of the different documents. But they're PDFs, so they're not searchable collectively. So I couldn't search all of these PDFs at once. I'd have to click on each one. These are all congressional records, so I wouldn't start here. Again, I'd start with the committee reports. It's there. As you can see, it's going to be quite cumbersome and difficult to use, which is why I prefer Hein Online. But again, if you don't have Hein Online, Westlaw would be my next step. Or it's possible my next step might be a free website. Much easier to use, obviously free, so available to you anywhere you have internet access. And we've been here before as well. This is congress.gov. And truth be told, I said I was going to show you this in my preferred order. I probably would go to congress.gov before I would go to Westlaw. Hein Online, if the gold standard didn't have it, Hein Online, I'd probably go to congress.gov first, just because it's free and it's easy. And hey, you can't beat it when it's got both. So let's take a look at page 41. So we've seen this before when we went to look at public laws. And we're going to go there again. So again, you want to know your all-important public law number, which at least for the original enactment of ERISA we do, or we could look again in the historical and statutory notes and figure out what other public laws are of interest. But let's take a look at the original enactment. So we know that's the 93rd Congress. So Congress.gov, we got lucky. That's as far back as it goes. And then within the 93rd Congress, I can scroll down to 406, or I can cheat a little bit and jump down to 406. Now once I get to 93-406, I'm going to click on the bill number. That's the only little confusing part, I think, about Congress.gov. There are no other links, so you probably figure it out anyway. And that brings us to this nice little compact report that Congress.gov gives for us. And it tells us what happened to it. So it's highlighted here. It became law. And here are the different steps, a very, very brief summary of the steps. And it gives us references to the reports. Unfortunately, it doesn't give us links. If Congress.gov had these reports online, these would be links here. And if you look at pages 42 and 43, you'll see those steps, as well as on page 43, that explanation. But at least I now know the different committee report numbers that I can try to track down somewhere else. I could try to Google them, or I could go to one of the other systems like Lexis or Westlaw and see if I can find those reports. So that's what I mean, Congress.gov. It's pretty basic, but it's easy. And again, for more recent, let's go back to home. So for more recent legislation, it will actually have the links. So let's take a look at, I'm just going to choose something randomly from the last Congress, and I'm going to the last Congress just because they're more likely to have links. So you can see this particular House report, it's linked to. So as I said, Congress.gov, it's pretty basic. It's not even going to necessarily have all of the committee reports, but especially for more recent legislation, it will have reports and it'll have links, and it's really easy to use. Okay, any questions about Congress.gov? So there's one more system I'll show you that some libraries have, possibly where you wind up working, possibly a library near where you wind up working. Again, you're always welcome to come back here to use it, and it's called ProQuest. And it's just another database the way HeinOnline is another database. So when you're here to get to ProQuest, again, you go down and you search the online resources. And when you search the online resources for ProQuest, this is what will come up. And if you click on this link, it will bring you here. And there's a lot of things this database does, but for legislative intent research, you'll want to go here to search for legislative histories. And again, on pages 44, I show you that. And turning to page 45, we want to search for, again, our all-important public law number, and that's why I call it that, because all of these systems, that's what you need to know in order to get the information you want. So our all-important public law number for ERISA, 93-406. Again, I will determine that from the credits or the history on Lexis. I might want to look at some of those other amendments, but I know that I want to look at the enacting legislation as well. And when I search for 93-406, for some reason it gives me two entries, but obviously we know which one we want, ERISA. And what ProQuest does for us is it gives us an abstract of the different documents that are produced. Now, we just went through that, so hopefully you have a better understanding of what each of these are. So we know we're mostly, or at least at first, interested in reports, so I can click on reports and jump down there. And it gives me some brief information. Now, a trick with using the reports on ProQuest, and one of the reasons ProQuest isn't at the top of my list is that it's not very straightforward, so you have to know to scroll to the last committee report, click on the link of the last committee report and see if that's a conference report or not. It doesn't tell you. Why it can't tell you is beyond me. So yes, I know that's a whole bunch of crazy steps, and why should it be this difficult? And those are excellent questions, and I've asked them that many times. And basically their answer is you should buy our new product called Legislative Insight, which is something in the neighborhood of $50,000 a year. So unfortunately, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So we make do with this one. So if you are at a place that has Legislative Insight, they make it much easier for you. But we have this version of ProQuest, which isn't terrible, but it's not as good as it could be. So anyway, so I went to the last report, I clicked on it, it told me it was the conference report. So I know I want to check this as well as some of the other reports. And the way I check it is to scroll a little further. I can look at the entire PDF, or I can go to specific pages if I somehow got page references, and again I can do Control F. I'm going to go back after the last report. I'm going to take a look at the other ones to see what committees. So Committee on Education and Labor, I probably want to look at that because that's probably relevant. Private pension tax reform, I probably won't look at that because our issue isn't a tax one. So there's one I can skip, hooray. But there's another one, Education and Labor, so I'm going to check those as well. So this is the analysis that you would need to go through in looking at the reports to determine which ones to look at and which ones you don't have to bother with. And that's what would happen on ProQuest. I certainly wouldn't go to ProQuest if I had Hein Online and my public law was on Hein Online. I still would probably, I don't know if I'd go to ProQuest or Westlaw first if I had them both. I'd probably do a quick check on Congress.gov just because it's free and it's easy. So at least I could take a look at the report there, and I wouldn't have to pay money on Westlaw or fight with ProQuest to do it. But sometimes, if you have to do a more thorough legislative intent research, ProQuest might be useful. Any questions? Okay. So I give you some screenshots on pages 45, 46, 47 on exactly what I just showed you. Last, and probably least, we're going to go back to the good old-fashioned print. Only because, again, as I mentioned when we first started statutory research, you will see citations to this in cases, in secondary sources, other places, and that is our friend USCAN. Remember, USCAN was one of the planets that our Hero 93406 lives back in our statutory introduction screencast. And we saw, as we see on page 48, volume 1, and these are pages we already saw. We saw on page 49, this is the beginning of our Hero Public Law 93406, and if we kept on turning the pages of volume 1 of USCAN, we would see the text of our Hero 93406. Again, the public law as it was passed by Congress, signed by the President. And if you're interested, you can pass this around again. But I alluded very briefly when we first talked about this that this is one of the things USCAN does. The other thing USCAN does is it republishes portions of legislative history, really selected committee reports. And you know that because if you look on page 49, right under the title, Employee Retirement Income Security Act, you see, for legislative history of acts, see page 4639. So you would have to go to page 4639, which it turns out is in volume 3. Actually, who has volume 1? Joshua? Would you look at the spine and tell me what it says on the very bottom? So it says laws. So that means that volume just has public laws. So volume 3, so Danielle, would you look in the bottom of volume 3 and tell us what it says there? Yeah. Oh no, not the number, sorry. Legislative history. So volume 1 says laws, volume 3 says legislative history. What that tells me is this will have the legislative history for the public laws that appear in volumes 1 and 2. So if I were to turn to page 4639 of this volume, you would see page 50. Actually, no, I'm sorry, you wouldn't say page 50. I scratched that. Turn to page 50. If you're still in volume 1, what you would see, and I pointed out this to you when we started statutes, you would see the section that talks about findings and declaration of policies. So this is Congress saying, we're passing this huge legislation, this is what we want to achieve by it. So that would be one place you would look for intent of Congress if you wanted to make, say, a policy argument. Now turning the page to page 51, volume 3, the title page of the volume I'm holding, turning to page 52, that's where you would see page 4639. In case you're interested or need to do your weightlifting. And what UScan is telling us is it's giving us a listing of all the available reports, and it's telling us that it's going to show us in the volume the House and Senate reports and the House conference reports. And so we then start to see the text of the report. So this would be a quick place, if you understand UScan, to get the reports. These days, I know most people are going to go on the web, and I don't blame you, it's easier. But as I said, you will see UScan cited to in court cases as well as other places, frequently citing to the reports as they are set out in UScan. So I wanted you to see what that looked like. Again, these days with all of these other systems online, especially congress.gov available for free, I rather doubt you have much need for UScan, but if you find yourself referred to it, that's what it is and that's how it works. Any questions? Now you notice I haven't discussed Lexis. Lexis does have a lot of these legislative history documents online, but frankly I find it incredibly confusing to use, and I would rely on congress.gov, again, which is free and available, before I would do battle with Lexis. If you find yourself working somewhere where that's all they have and that's what's available to you, first make sure that it's in your plan and it's not going to cost thousands of dollars to look at it, and then I would just call the Lexis helpline and ask them to help you get to what you need. I haven't mentioned the Lexis, Westlaw, or Bloomberg helplines much, but now is as good an opportunity as any. Those are actually pretty good research resources themselves, especially obviously when you're on that system and you need help finding particular types of document, a particular document, even if you need help constructing a search. They have research attorneys available, usually 24/7, so 2 a.m. in your pajamas. You can usually call and find them. And they can help you with your research. So if I had to use Lexis for this, that's how I would go about doing it. Questions? Okay. So we do have